This is the first webinar in the 2025 New York State World Languages Professional Learning Series. My name is Candace Black, and I am your World Language Associate in the Office of Bilingual Education and World Languages of the New York State Education Department. Welcome to Languages for All, universal design for differentiation from the start. All students should have access to language learning. So how can we effectively differentiate for all learners? This webinar will provide a brief introduction to Universal Design for Learning, or UDL, and its implications for language learning. Through this lens, instead of the time-consuming process of creating modifications and accommodations after creating a lesson, participants will develop strategies for cultivating agency and empowering self-differentiation for all learners right from the start of the planning process, including steps they can take the very next day. Our workshop presenter today is Rebecca Aubrey. Rebecca has over 20 years of teaching experience at the college level and 15 years of experience teaching Spanish in grades K through 8. As an advocate for equitable access to quality language learning from an early age, Rebecca has presented broadly on topics that include differentiation, target language use, thematic planning, and language proficiency. She's the 2019 ACTIFL National Teacher of the Year and has served as president of CT Colt, executive secretary for And Now, and the pre-K representative to the AATSP Board of Directors. Rebecca also serves as an independent consultant for ACTIFL and school districts across the country. She is passionate about exploring the cultural and linguistic diversity of our world and equally passionate about empowering students to do the same. Without further ado, it is my pleasure to invite Rebecca to begin this webinar.
Thank you so much. I will go ahead and share my screen. So thank you everyone first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to meet with you today. And thank you so much to all of you who have, shown up after school, I'm guessing, and are here with me. I don't know what the weather's like in New York, but I was texting one of my New York friends earlier today, and she said it was 8 degrees out. I said, well, it was 7 degrees here in Connecticut. So I do really appreciate you all here. I'm also really excited and honored to have you here to listen about a topic that is just very near and dear to my heart. And that is about how we can ensure that all students have access to learning another language. And that means how we can ensure that all students actually have that access and are able to access our curriculum and our programs and feel successful in them. It's interesting, I started teaching languages in an elementary level. And most elementary schools, in my experiences, all students take a language class. And very often it's largely because that's the teacher's prep time. So there's nowhere else for those students to go. They're not necessarily pulled for other things, although sometimes they might be. And I, in my earliest experiences, never had any paraprofessional supports for some of the students with the highest needs who might otherwise have supports throughout the day. And so from very early on, I saw that language classrooms could be a place where any student can be successful if the right supports are put into place. I always think of this one example of these two boys I had in my first couple of years of teaching. And one of them, his name was Shakir, had some pretty significant learning disabilities. And he was actually pulled from his classroom for most of his English language arts, his math instruction, to a specialized classroom. But in the interest of time on task with peers, he was kept in my Spanish class. And he actually really excelled in my class because of all the struggles he had in other areas. He had developed a hypersensitive auditory processing skills. So he was able to hear everything and understand things and repeat things back. He had a good memory for the things that he heard in Spanish. He just could not read or write anything that he was hearing in Spanish. And he had a friend, Jareem, who was very bright, performed very well academically, but just something about the Spanish language that didn't click with him. And when I put the two of them together, it was so much fun to see how Shakir could remember anything and everything, and then Jareem would have to help him write it down. And so I just really saw how thinking more openly about how we're including students in our classrooms can really help them to be successful. And so it was really surprising to me when my daughter, who also has some significant learning disabilities, loved Spanish in elementary school and then went to middle school where she was removed from her Spanish classes because she required some pretty intensive supports in English and reading. So she sat in her English and reading, I'm sorry, her English and math classes all day and then was pulled out of Spanish so that she could get extra support catching her up in English and math. And we actually know that a lot of the research shows us that learning another language helps students with literacy skills in their first language because we teach them so many decoding skills. We teach them patterns of language by making those comparisons to the language that they're studying. And so it was a battle that I did not win with her, but it's a battle that made me such a stronger advocate for to ensure that all students have access to a language. And in spite of the fact that she was not allowed to take class all throughout middle school, she was actually highly skilled at learning another language. Here we are in Mexico together, where she was able to order food in restaurants herself. She was able to navigate a lot of things because she had those skills. And so I always just feel like I want to continue to be an advocate in her honor for all of those students who aren't allowed to take another language. For those of you looking for resources to advocate for your students, the Language Connects Foundation also has a lot of good resources for what a language provides and why it's so essential that every student study another language, and just the connections it helps us to develop, the way it feeds the brain, helps us develop empathy with other cultures, facilitates travel, boosts confidence. There are just so many important things that we gain from learning another language. So today, I was just very honored to meet with you and talk about some of the strategies for ensuring that we can support all learners in our classroom. And I just want to pause for a moment to say something I forgot to say at the beginning, and that is I would really like to acknowledge one of my colleagues, Kelsey Sullivan, who has been my thought partner on a lot of work that's related to this presentation. When Candy reached out to me to invite me to do this webinar, she invited me to repeat something that I had done at Actful, and it was actually a presentation I did together with Kelsey. And Kelsey is a third-year teacher and is doing some really good stuff with ensuring inclusion in her classroom. So this presentation was originally inspired by some of the work Kelsey and I do together, but it is a presentation that was intended for an in-person conference, so I adapted it significantly for this virtual session. So, as the title implies, we will very briefly talk about what universal design is. It's unfortunate we don't have time to really dive very deeply into it, but we'll talk about some of the fundamental pieces of it. Secondly, we're going to look at universal design from the bigger planning perspective. You're sitting down, beginning to plan a unit, what you might want to consider from the very beginning, because that's really what universal design is about, is how from the very beginning of the planning process, you can consider all of the varied needs of your students. But I also realize you don't want to spend an hour of your time sitting in a webinar where you're hearing about strategies that you might not be able to use tomorrow, that you have to wait to rewrite a whole unit to implement. So I'm hoping today to find a proper balance between some of that bigger picture thinking, but also some things that you might want to start to try tomorrow when you go back to school. So without further ado, we'll just kind of get going. So the UDL principles have been developed by an organization called CAST, and they publish them all freely on their website. I encourage you to explore it. They just updated their matrix for universal design for learning not too long ago. And on their website, they have many recorded webinars and resources about breaking down the different parts of UDL and how to use them. So I encourage you to go there. But this graphic, this matrix, is a summary of those principles of universal design for learning. And so it has these three categories of engagement, representation, and expression, but then also looks at each of them through access, support, and executive functioning. And I'm just going to chunk them up a little bit and review them a little bit with you, especially in light of some of the things that are particularly that world languages naturally leans itself towards. And so if we begin by talking about multiple means of engagement and welcoming identities, I think one of the most important, powerful things about studying another language is the way we introduce students to different cultures and different languages and different ways of doing things and really addressing those biases. So we help make things culturally relevant. We'll be talking today about strategies for making learning authentic and purposeful. Um, so these are the different multiple means of engagement and welcoming those different identities. Secondly, under that, some of the strategies for sustaining effort and persistence are having clarity with learning goals. This is something we'll talk about today. High expectations, high and challenging expectations for all. Um, and finally, under multiple means of engagement, we have strategies for developing emotional capacity. And so these are how we develop learners, students who are engaged learners. And a lot of this connects to the community standard, the world readiness standards about how we are empowering lifelong language learners. And so I'm excited to talk a little bit about some ideas to share with you with regards to that. The second area is multiple means of representation. And so this is how we are representing the learning for our students. And so to begin looking at how we might present information to students in different ways using multiple modalities, whether that be written, spoken, visual, ensuring that we're offering a diversity of perspectives, which I think is also something that we inherently do in a lot of language learning. And challenging stereotypes is something else that we do inherently in a lot of language teaching. So again, in terms of language and symbols, looking at how we can pre-teach vocabulary, especially critical vocabulary, and we'll talk a little bit about that today. Supporting text with imagery, we know is such an essential strategy for making target language comprehensible for students, as well as teaching decoding strategies. We'll talk about some options for text-to-speech today. I think as language educators, and I can speak from the Spanish teacher perspective, looking even just at linguistic diversity within the languages that we teach, there's so much diversity in the Spanish language. You know, if you could have lengthy conversations about all the different ways to say popcorn or to say chin or to refer to a jacket or how a word might mean something very innocuous in one Spanish speaking culture and could be a slur in another Spanish speaking culture. And also the role of nonverbal communication is important. Finally, under multiple means of representation are the ways that we might build knowledge with our students. So tapping into how we can connect to prior knowledge, use of graphic organizers, cross-curricular connections is also very important in languages. That's that connections standard that we have and the other world readiness standards. We'll talk today, I'll share some examples or some strategies for queuing critical information, how we might do some chunking or omitting distracting information. I know this is a lot to throw at you. Finally, the third area is multiple means of action and expression. One of the things my colleague Kelsey is really good at is looking at different ways we might elicit responses from students. And if we think about those strategies ahead of time, it makes that differentiation a lot easier in the moment. The use of manipulatives, flexible learning spaces. My students, their absolute favorite place to work in my room is under my desk. I teach sixth grade currently, but they love to go under my desk. There are actually LED lights hung up in there. They call it my special recording studio. I have gum in my top desk drawer. I have some students who know it's there. I personally don't like gum, but some of them need it to concentrate. Secondly, looking at the different ways that students might express themselves. So again, those choices in how to respond using different tools and scaffolds, thinking about gradual release of flexibility. I'll talk a little bit about some strategies for feedback today. And lastly, thinking again about how we're developing our students as learners, how we model goal setting for them, how we might use different types of checklists for them. And so I know that was kind of a very quick overview of the UDL guidelines. And I'd kind of like to, I know it's a lot to try to process. I really encourage you to look at them, but I'd like to move into starting to think about some of the strategies and how we can take some of these and what they might look like in a language classroom. And as I was brainstorming, adapting this presentation, and how it can be most useful to all of you, I really began to look at it through a backwards planning model. And so backwards planning is one of the high leverage teaching practices for world languages. It has 3 steps. Many of you may or may not already be familiar with backwards planning. But the first step of backwards planning is to identify what the learning outcomes are for our students. And so these are the essential questions. What is the proficiency target? What are the enduring understandings? What are the essential skills and learning students will acquire through the unit? Secondly, what are the acceptable results? So if step 1 is what do I want my students to know and be able to do? Step 2 is how am I going to know that they got there? So these are your assessments. These are how you're doing both your formative and your summative assessments with your students to know their progress towards reaching those goals. And third step is to plan our learning experiences. This is how we're going to get students there. And so I decided to kind of organize this webinar into these categories of thinking first of that big picture planning and how from the very beginning when we sit down to plan a unit, we can ensure universal design for learning, universal access right from that stage 1. As I said at the beginning, I also recognize that some of you are probably really hoping to walk away from this today with some strategies that you can try tomorrow or later this week. And so I hope to also, as we go through the steps of backwards planning, talk a little bit more about that. So first, stage 1 are the learning outcomes. And this is what do I want my students to learn and be able to do? And so what are the UDL implications at this stage? First and foremost, it's really important to continue to keep in mind that we want to have high and challenging expectations for all students. This standard pushes all individuals to reach their full potential by requiring significant effort. True learning does not happen with significant effort and even sometimes some challenge, some things that are hard. Because that's how skills are going to develop. When my students tell me in my class, Profe, this is hard. I'm really having a hard time with this. I just get so excited and I'll say, yes, this means we're going to learn something here today. And they need that. And they need to know that learning can sometimes be hard. As teachers, we have such an inherent desire to nurture and protect our students and to take care of them. But we have to remember that it's very difficult for significant learning to take place without significant effort. And so we really need to communicate to our students that we are going to hold them to high and challenging expectations, but that we also believe that they can do it. And as a side, while this presentation is not about culturally responsive teaching practices, this is one of those critical elements of culturally responsive teaching and addressing equity gaps, which is to ensure that we're holding all students to high and challenging expectations. Often they can do more than what they think is possible. Secondly, and one of the critical elements of UDL is to ensure that our learning goals, what we want students to learn, is authentic and purposeful. And we know from a lot of the research in language learning that students need to feel a sense of purpose with the language that they're using in order to own it. When they learn language that's in an isolated context, it's a lot more difficult for students to know it and to apply it. During the pandemic, I had the wonderful opportunity to facilitate a panel that the NFLC led of middle school students talking about their experiences as virtual learners. And this quote from that panel really always sticks out to me, where we asked the students, what do you most want teachers to know as you're going through this phase of your learning? And one of the students, she was actually my student, Ava, in the top right-hand corner, just said, please just make it real. Students want to learn about things that matter or will matter to them in the real world. And it's authentic and purposeful learning experiences are so powerful for engaging our students And again, looking towards culturally responsive teaching, we want to also make sure that we're engaging our students in themes that are authentic and purposeful to them and to their communities. I just as an example, I work in a district where we have a very large Indian population. And so very often when we're making cultural comparisons and we build units around making cultural linguistic comparisons, we're not always comparing to the target culture we're studying in the US. Like, for example, we're starting a unit right now that's about Puerto Rico. It's not always necessarily just comparing Puerto Rico to the US or to Connecticut, but also looking at how Puerto Rico might compare to their homes in different parts of India. And so making those authentic connections are really powerful. But students really care about things that are happening in the real world. And so to the extent that we can try to develop units that tie to thematic themes that students care about, that is going to provide better access to our students. So one of the units that we do that I wanted to model as I'm talking about some examples today is that we have a unit that is all about how we can do a better job of taking care of the environment. And students really care about this issue. And so the learning is often very powerful for them. I'm going to play a very short clip from one of my students. This is a sixth grader talking about why it's important to protect our oceans out of respect for the people who don't understand or speak Spanish. I did put a rough translation of what he says on the side. He is a very novice level speaker, so you'll notice he makes a lot of mistakes. But what I find so powerful about the video, it's actually just a sound recording, is the passion that comes across in his voice. So even if you don't understand every word you say, the passion that comes across is so powerful because this is such an authentic, real world unit that the students really cared about.
Es mucho importante proteger los océanos because los océanos producen muchos oxígeno y los animales comen muchos basura en los océanos. Alusión es los humanos comen los animales del océano de basura. Los contaminación es reducir los porcientos de oxígeno es muchos muertes de animales. Save los océanos.
And so you can hear his passion coming through here as he's struggling to communicate with the limited Spanish that he knows. And it's so cute how at the end he tries to say save the oceans and he says save no sabe los océanos, and sabe is not even a word in Spanish, but you hear that passion coming through, the sadness about all the deaths of animals. And so really thinking about from the very beginning how you can identify thematic units that your students are going to care about. We, in sixth grade, to give you some examples of some of our units, it's pretty much their first year of Spanish. They have an exploratory program in the elementary school. And in sixth grade, they've just come up to the middle school. So we begin with some reflections on how their elementary school and middle school are similar and different. But then we begin to look at equity of access to education in different parts of the world with a focus on Guatemala. And the students look at some different, very innovative programs that help children go to school in Guatemala. And they develop such a deep interest in this and a passion about one of the programs where they build schools out of garbage. They have communities collect water bottles and plastic bottles and they stuff them with garbage and they use that to build schools. And the students are just so deeply engaged in this. We're just starting right now a unit that's about natural disasters and how communities recover from natural disasters. And it's something else that they're just deeply interested in. And so it's a nice way to hook them in to then developing some of those different language skills. One of the other critical elements of UDL that's very, that we should consider at this stage one is the ways that we can provide students with choice. And we can do that right with the learning outcomes. I'm sharing with you here a folder that Leslie Gran shared at NECTFL. And one of the things that she has in that folder is a template for eliciting student input into a unit before you begin it. Now, just because you're asking for their input, it doesn't mean that you have to do everything that they ask for, but it's a wonderful way to get some insights into your students' interests. And then just even consider how you might be able to begin to incorporate that into some of your units. And so Leslie did give me permission to share this, so I encourage you to check out that folder of resources that she has. Secondly, another really important piece of this stage is that you as an educator have real clarity with the learning goals that you have as part of the unit, but that students also understand those learning goals. I'm not sure about in New York, but clarity with learning goals is a very hot topic in Connecticut right now. And we have regular walkthroughs in my building where teachers are coming in and observing other classrooms, and we all have to take turns doing it and going up to students and asking them if they understand what they're learning, why they're learning about it, and how they'll know if they've made it. But those clarity with learning goals are really important to help students develop ownership over what they're learning about. So, thinking both in terms of language proficiency, this is a bulletin board that I have up in my room. Most of my students move through the novice level in their first year. And so we constantly have conversations around what language looks at, like at the novice low, novice mid, and novice high levels. They know what those targets are. And so there's that, what am I learning about? But also, this is the what am I learning about? So that's both the language skills, but also those thematic units. Why am I learning about it? So why is this important in a real world? And it's really hard to have a lengthy, compelling explanation about why it's important to conjugate AR and ER verbs correctly. But if our students are learning that language for a specific communicative purpose, that why am I learning about it becomes a lot more compelling. Now, last year, when we were doing these walkthroughs, I had this student, Allie, who, this is not actually Allie, this is an AI generated image of Allie. But Allie, when we started talking about natural disasters and why might it be important to know how to talk about natural disasters, I said we'd be learning about hurricanes, about volcanoes, about earthquakes. And Allie looks at me and goes, Profe, but like, why do we need to learn about volcanoes? Like, why would that ever relate to me if volcanoes are hot and the only natural disaster we ever have in Connecticut are blizzards? Like, a volcano is hot, a blizzard is cold. Well, why would I need to know about this? Why is this going to be any good to me? And I said, Allie, that is a really, really good question. And we wrote it on the board, and it was on the board for the whole unit. And when we got to the end of the unit, where we'd been talking a lot about being able to transfer language from a known topic, a studied topic, to unfamiliar topics, I asked the students to respond to a prompt in Spanish in which they had to share what are the consequences of a blizzard and how people can need to respond after a blizzard and prepare for a blizzard. And we hadn't talked about that through the whole unit, but it was really empowering to see how students were able to transfer what they had learned about volcanoes to this new topic. And so she kept rolling her eyes at me every time I raised the question. But really thinking about the implications of the why. And then finally, how will I know that I'm successful at it? And that's really having some clarity with those learning goals, how you're being measured, and what you're going to do to continue to grow, which is something that we'll talk a little bit more about. So the second stage to backwards planning is determining the acceptable evidence. And so this is your assessment. How am I going to know that my students have gotten there? And I want to ground again in these high and challenging expectations for all, and really setting the belief that we believe that all students can learn another language and that we're going to challenge them, but we're going to provide them with proper support as we challenge them. If we come back to proficiency guidelines, something that we practice is an understanding that what is a high and challenging expectation is not necessarily going to be the same for all students. When I first began in my program, we had proficiency targets set for each grade, and we were only measuring students up against that proficiency target. And so for our first year of our program, it was a novice mid proficiency target or performance towards proficiency. And I pretty quickly had students who were consistently performing at a novice mid level. And there really wasn't much incentive for them to continue to grow because they were acing everything. They could hit those novice mid proficiency targets every time, but there was no incentive for them to challenge themselves to something higher. And at the same time, we sometimes have students, because of different learning disabilities or being differently abled, aren't able to ever hit that target. Yet we're continually holding them to something that they can't meet. And so why not start to look at how we can even differentiate that? And this slide is from my colleague Kelsey. It's something we've worked on together. But what we typically do is look at how we can differentiate the can-do statements that we might have for a unit. So all of our students are kind of doing the same can-do statement, but we're meeting them kind of where they're at. And so while I would never advocate for keeping a student at a novice low level for more than a couple of weeks, we do have some students who are just differently abled, and that's where they are, and that's where we need to meet them. And so we can differentiate our can-do statements. So all our students are studying the same topic, just how they're showing it might be a little bit different. And so that same can-do statement, but for novice low, it might be using simple words versus at novice high, it might be using memorized sentences and details. I'm going to show you these are just screenshots of a couple of examples. And so their prompt was to talk about why ocean contamination is important. And this was about all that this student could produce at the start of the unit. And I just did a rough translation of what he said from his Spanish to English to make this accessible to everyone here. But he was basically only able to say, this is ocean, protect the fish, something I could not, and I am the most sympathetic listener in the world. I could not figure out what he said. He said, recycle plastic, reduce of the plastic. Exact same prompt. This is another student's response. So you can see this student is moving much more closely to full memorized sentences. And finally, same prompt, same class, same activities. We see this much more developed response from another student. And so where this is powerful is that all of the students are being held to high and challenging expectations. It's just where each of them are at that moment. And none of them are held back. There isn't a ceiling on what we're asking them to do, but we're not asking them to necessarily do anything that is unattainable for them at that time. Yet. They can't do it yet. Another important practice for universal design for learning that also aligns very nicely with high-level teaching practices is providing feedback. And so we try to always provide our feedback in the form of 2 stars and a wish. You might sometimes hear 2 glows and a grow. And so we're really specific in the language that we use so that it aligns with what our proficiency, our performance towards proficiency rubrics stay. So calling out the fact that this student did a great job using a couple of short phrases. And he used 1 sentence starter, there is, that we had practiced. The feedback for this student is that she was actually using more sentence frames. She was able to elaborate with details. And so this student, I want to try to start to push them towards using more of a variety of sentence frames. And so the feedback is very individualized and specific and intended to help them to continue to grow. Last student who was using much more complex sentences, a lot more elaboration. I want to try to push her towards that intermediate level with the language creation. And so this feedback is intended to both acknowledge what they're doing very well, but push some action towards how they can continue to grow. And so this is one of those things, if it's not already, you can't brainstorm how it could be built into your assessments, you could certainly try to practice some of it this week with your students. Having in both individual and collective reflection is also another important strategy for universal design for learning. So we have our students regularly self-reflect on their own work. It's something that takes a lot of practice. It takes a lot of teaching, but having them go through and think about what are the things that they can talk about? How will they talk about it? And they're not often aware of how easy they can be understood. But we always have students do these ongoing reflections that then guide them towards some individualized goal setting, which is another important strategy for universal design for learning. So you see this student identified a goal of trying to begin to engage in language creation because it wasn't something that she circled at the bottom that she was able to do yet. And so through a lot of this reflection, we see that students really start to grow. So I shared with you the example from this boy earlier, where at the beginning of the unit, this was about all that he could talk about at the topic. And through the feedback that was targeted to him in the practice, by the end of the unit, he was able to move towards many more short phrases and elaborate a lot more on the topic. Another essential element of universal design for learning is looking at all of the different ways that we can provide students with choice. And so a very simple one in an environment unit is at the end of the unit in the assessment, they chose whether they wanted to talk about deforestation or ocean contamination. And actually, they also could choose air pollution, but no one did that one. Everyone was just about the oceans or the forests. But just giving them that simple choice empowers students to talk about something that they feel more passionately about. For me as a language teacher, I was looking for a lot of the transferable language chunks, like it produces, it is important for, without this, we don't have this. And so those were transferable across both of the themes, whether it was deforestation or ocean contamination. And so I could see that they had picked up those essential communicative chunks. There's just so many ways we can offer students choice. In this example, you just see my students did seesaw entries, but often when our students do a seesaw recording, they might draw on the screen, they might draw on a piece of paper and take a photograph of it. They might create a brochure, they might create a website and take a screenshot. There's just, if we had the time and the space, I'd love to open up the chat to talk about the different ways that you can offer students choice in their assessments, but really the sky's the limit. And I have to share this cute little video with you for one student who insisted on singing and dancing his presentation for us.
And la foto and mucho plástico and continuation and manos and la tuma foto and no reducer and la plástico and montachi.
And so this was a student who just really liked to perform and felt very strongly about it. Sorry. And so just offering these choices and how students are expressing themselves, always keeping in mind that we have things that we're measuring them on, that we need them to show, but why not allow them to express themselves the way that they're most comfortable in expressing themselves? Really essential piece of universal design for learning. Technology offers us so many tools for offering student choice and how they're showing evidence of their learning. I already mentioned Seesaw. I really generally like to ask that my students record themselves so that I can hear them talking. But it doesn't have to always be that way. It could be in writing. So in Seesaw, they could enter something in writing. They could do a recording. They could do a video. They could just do an audio recording. Just thinking about what it is you're assessing. If I'm assessing their accuracy with pronunciation, then I probably need to hear a recording. But if I'm assessing, can they formulate an argument about something, whether they're saying it spoken or they've written it down, it might be the same. Formative allows audio responses, so you can turn on to allow an audio response instead of a written response. You can also do that in Edpuzzle. I have a lot of students who use the speech to text features in Google Docs or Google Slides when they struggle to spell something out but can speak it in their minds. Why not let them just use speech to text in some of those resources? I had a student who just did it last week for an assessment, and she feels very confident in it. And I just coach them that if Google Docs starts to flag things as misspelled or wrong, to just ignore it, because I just want to know what they know how to say. Google Read and Write is another incredible tool where, again, it's an extension on Chrome that you can download, assuming your district allows it if you're a Google district, and it allows students easier access to speech to text. And so when they go into speech to text, they can change it to the language of instruction, speak, and Google will recognize it and type it on the page, but it'll also read it back to them. So this is actually my student's initial assessment that she did the other day about the Incas, where she did speech to text, but then she could go back and have the speech to text read it back to her. You can change the language and speech to text to whatever language you're teaching. So when she changes it to Spanish, A lovely woman reads it out loud in Spanish to her. If she doesn't change it to Spanish, it's someone trying to read Spanish as if it were English and it doesn't work. So you just have to change the language, but it's such a wonderful tool. The last area we're going to talk about in about the next 10 minutes I have is the learning experiences, how we're going to get students there. And hopefully this will be kind of more the area where you can share some things that you might want to try, over the next week. So first and foremost, there's so much research about the importance of clarity of learning goals and having consistent routines for your students. And this is an important trauma-informed practice. It's a culturally responsive practice. It's also something that supports learners with anxiety, because you're making it predictable, and that predictable is safe. But it's also really essential for supporting target language use. If you have consistent patterns, it's one less thing that the students need to figure out if you're using the target language full on. So I start every class with a slide that looks like this. My template might change for the unit, but we always review what our learning objective is. We have a warm up, and then we do an overview of activities. And we start every single class reviewing the slides, and student volunteers will raise their hand, they'll read it. And I'll tell you, on those days when there's a fire drill and I tell them we're just going to jump right into things, they demand to know what the overview of the class is for day. It's very reassuring to them. Another really great tool that is a practice for universal design for learning, but we also know supports language learning, is looking at the ways that we can pre-teach essential vocabulary. So that's one of the things we do through a lot of games with our unit about the environment, and looking at how we're supporting text with imagery. Instead of direct translation, how we can support the vocabulary that we're teaching with actual imagery. And that imagery, this is what you see here on the screen is from a Quizlet game. We like to do a lot of Quizlets to just kind of spark students, to ignite them when we start class, but it's also a great way to pre-teach vocabulary. We'll often use a Quizlet for something they've never even seen before, and it helps to pre-teach it to them in a fun way. But we can also look even at infographics as strategies for supporting text with imagery. And so for the non-Spanish speakers, this is looking at plastic contamination and how there are 1 million plastic bottles sold in the world every year. So my students sometimes might not know the word million, but now they're inferring it from the picture and the context. Looking at things like straws, the plastic bags that are floating. So they're getting all of these key vocabulary words through these different images. And things like the dolphins dying in the ocean. It's also something that we can do with things like infographics. So this is exactly how I presented it to my students. We started with the big infographic, which was just too overwhelming for them at a novice level to be able to interpret and understand it all. We can take little screenshots of it to help cue them in to some of the most critical information. So did you know that 100 dolphins can die from one plastic bag? And just think about how cueing in on that critical information, such powerful information, really helps students understand the impact of plastic contamination. But now they're also picking up so much critical vocabulary for this. Now they've learned that word for bag, bolsa, because it's come up several times. And now they're beginning to understand plastic bags are a problem, and plastic bag in Spanish is bolsa de plástico. And so cueing that critical information. One of my favorite tools when you're looking at things on paper is to use highlighters. We have a lot of students who might get very overwhelmed with a lot of text, and highlighters are a great way to chunk up and cue in on what some of the most important things are. I also really like highlighters. This is a trick I learned observing elementary classes, just general education classes. But I find it's a really effective strategy, particularly for students with dyslexia or students who can't track effectively to copy a word down from the board onto a piece of paper, where you as the teacher can write the words out with a highlighter and they trace over it. I have a student right now who really won't write in most of his classes. He doesn't like to be singled out. I feared that he might feel singled out by using this strategy, but he actually really likes it a lot because it makes him feel like he can do what everyone else in the room is doing. That as I am talking about vocabulary words, he's able to begin to copy them down himself, even though he's just tracing over the words that I already highlighted for him ahead of time. Thinking about different types of school tools and scaffolds that you might use. And so this is a graphic organizer, a brainstorming page that we created as our students were learning to talk about ocean contamination, also forest contamination, as a great way to kind of organize their ideas. And this is something our students are used to doing in their English language arts classes already. One of the things I'll often do is ask the English teacher if she has graphic organizers that she's using, and then try to recreate them in Spanish, because if the students are already familiar with them, it makes it a lot easier. A couple years ago, we created digital notebooks for our students. We did this during the pandemic when we were struggling with how can I get notes pages to the students who are at home. We had a lot of students who stayed home for learning and joined virtually. So we created these digital notebooks, and you can find templates for these on places like Slides Mania and some of those other resources. I'm happy to share one of my templates with you. But you'll see that the notebook actually has different sections where they collect all of their notes for the unit. And we can also preload it with resources. Like my students don't have very good fluency with numbers, so we provide them with a chat mat with numbers in it. They keep this for the whole unit. It's a Google slideshow. They keep it on their. So whenever they need to refer to a chat mat or to an anchor chart or something, it'll be there in the digital notebook, and I don't have to worry about them losing things. But it's such an important scaffold that supports them with a lot of their learning. So we'll put all sorts of graphic organizers in there. We have some that are for sentence frames that we're practicing, some language to use when they're playing a game with other people in class. So really you can put, really think about the tools and the scaffolds that they might need. We've just wrapped up our unit today or last week, and we're doing some wrap up today. I always do a survey at the end of every unit of my students. And when we were talking about our digital notebooks, I kept saying to them, like, where are you going to go if you need help? And they said, digital notebooks. And I said, why do you have it? And they all knew to say, because Profe loves us so much, she wants us to be successful. So in my Google feedback form, I had several students tell me that they knew I loved them because I gave them lots of resources to help them be successful in class. Again, reminder of some of those technology tools that we have that can help us provide students with choice and learning activities. Again, really thinking about what the purpose is and how you can provide lots of choice within that purpose. Collective work is also a great universal design for learning strategy, and it's also a culturally responsive practice. So thinking about how you can engage your students in different types of projects that require collective work. I know there's a lot that goes into group projects, and some kids hate them and some kids love them, but we just finished them up, and it was one of the most popular things this quarter that my students did. But the collective work doesn't have to be just those projects. It can be every class period. You can look at ways that you can provide your students with collective learning experiences. And one of the best ways to do that is through play. Hats off to all my early language teacher friends, because play is such an important part of early language classrooms and early learning in general, but we seem to lose it as the kids get older. But there's so much research around how play is such a powerful experience. This is a game my students love to play. It's like headbends, where one student holds up a picture or a card, and then their peer needs to describe it using circumlocution, and the first student will listen and tell them, like, try to guess what it is that they're holding up. So that's play, but it's also eliciting such great circumlocution skills and getting them to practice that. Jenga is another game that we love to play, where I write numbers on the blocks, and as students play in a group, they'll have a paper and each number aligns with the question, and I can change the questions. It's just printed on a piece of paper according to the unit. But if I pull out a block and I pull out number 17, Candy will look at the paper and tell me the question that's on number 17. She asks me the question, and I need to give the answer before I can put the block back up. So there you're getting kids engaging in some scaffolded interpersonal communication, but it's very playful because they're doing it with the blocks, which are manipulative and fun. Number one rule, though, about this is play it on the floor, because when these blocks fall over the table and make loud noises and are flying across the room, it's no longer very fun for the teacher. But also just encouraging play from our students. And this even goes back to that choice where one of my students were doing a small performance assessment, and one of my students asked if she could bring in a puppet, and she did her whole performance assessment speaking through the puppet. And that is exactly 4:50. I have 10 minutes left for questions. I know that was a lot really fast, but I'm happy to take any questions you have.
So at this point, we would invite people to put their questions in the chat, and we will deliver these to Rebecca. First of all, Rebecca, I want to let you know that the comments have been flowing very, very generously for how excited people are for the ideas that you've shared, from how cute your students are, how engaged they are, the great examples, the great ideas. There's a lot of inspiration here. And your elementary ed folks are also very pleased that you are here. They made several comments in that way. One of the initial questions was about programs that you were using with your students, and then you subsequently had a slide that identified the various programs, excuse me, from Seesaw to Formative and Edpuzzle and more. So I think that question was already answered. Someone asked, do you provide words to help with the headbands game?
Yes, what we provide, and I'll go back a couple of slides. Oh, here we go. Is you'll actually see the student in the pink shirt is the one holding up the card, and the student in the gray shirt on the left is the one trying to describe it. And in the middle of the table, they have a chat mat. So we don't always provide words, but instead more the language chunks. So the chat mat had things like, I think this was related to our unit about the Incas. And so the chat mat says things like, it is a food, the color is, and so we give them those language chunks for them to be able to describe it.
Thank you. Someone's asking if you see your students every day.
I currently see them 4 times a week for 50 minutes.
That's so fortunate.
Yes, it is very fortunate. I actually, I had a
Go ahead.
nightmare. I had a nightmare last night that they turned my class into a special and I only got them twice a week. I kid you not,
Oh,
last
dear.
night, that was my nightmare. Yeah.
That would not be good. So someone else is asking about grading. What have you done about traditional grading? Are students still given number grades, or is it more feedback on their proficiency?
I get that question all the time. I'll tell you personally, I hate traditional grades because I see that they often tend to focus more on compliance with language than with what students can actually do. So our rubrics all carry points that transfer into traditional grades, but we do regular conferencing with students, a lot of regular self-reflection, so that when we get to the end of the unit, as we did last week, I'll meet with each student one by one, and I'll say, you know, Joanne, I've noticed on the last several activities and assignments, you've been doing a really good job of consistently performing at the novice high level. I'd like to give you a novice high rubric for the assessment. Is that okay with you? Do you understand what that means, what that would look like? And Joanne might ask a couple of questions, or she might be like, yes, or sometimes they'll go, can I have an intermediate mid? And I'll go, well, not yet. But so that rubric that she gets is out of 30 points. Now I'm looking at Virginia sitting on the screen right below Joanne. Virginia might come over and I'll go, you know, Virginia, you have been really pushing yourself. I love all the phrases that you've been using and how you're really putting different words together. You've been doing a great job at performing at a novice mid-level. I'd like to give you that kind of rubric for the assessment. Are you okay with that? And Virginia will say yes. And so Virginia's rubric will also be out of 30 points. Now, if Joanne goes and like completely bombs it and really couldn't sustain, I know you wouldn't, Joanne, but couldn't
You never know.
sustain couldn't sustain that novice high level, I'll just slide it back to a novice mid. I'll often I actually had this boy who has an IEP, is a struggling learner academically in many classes, but pushes himself in my class and is always asking how he can get better. He started with a novice mid rubric, but he blew way out of the novice mid rubric. So I graded him on the novice high one, and that's what went into the grade book.
Thank you for that very complex and robust answer. I don't see any additional questions, but I certainly do see many, many thanks and statements of gratitude. So Bill has put the PDF of the slides in the folder. I'm also going to enter the links to two of the sites that you mentioned. One was the CAST site where the UDL guidelines are, and the other was the Language Connects Foundation for the benefits of language learning. And oh, and I forgot to put the link in. So let's see. I think so. Someone asked, can you give another example of a chat mat? So I'll give you that question while I throw this last link in.
Sure. So so we do a lot that might be for describing. I wish I had some ready to pull up for you. One of the things, a personal goal of mine this year with my novice students has been to help them learn how to formulate their own questions. Because that's one of those indicators for moving from novice into the intermediate level. And I found that I was always telling my students that, but not necessarily working on them with it. So I have some chat mats that we use for like our circle check-ins. That'll be something like, what did you do over the weekend? And then the person who asks them that needs to ask at least one follow-up question. And they have on the chat mat, with who, in Spanish, with who, where, and what day, and like when, with who, where, and what, and when. And because they didn't know those questions, I put little cues below it. So in the where, it said like at my house in Spanish, my friend's house, at a friend's house, and blank. Or the when said Saturday, Sunday, or both days in Spanish. And so that those cues cued them in to what, where, when, and with who meant. And so that's an example of another one we use a lot.
Thank you. Someone actually is asking what a chat mat is. Can you give a brief definition of that? Oh, you're on mute, Rebecca.
Sorry. Great question. A chat mat is a resource that a student may have printed out in front of them. It could be hung up on the wall, and it helps to scaffold a conversation. So again, the chat mat we had was, I was just talking about, what did you do over the weekend? And so I might turn to Joannie and say, Joannie, what did you do over the weekend? And Joannie can say, I blank. And then there's several options. There's like a clip art that'll show me playing sports, talking on my phone, sleeping, cooking something. And so Joannie can look at that and say, I cooked. And so the chat mat is kind of scaffolded in a way to help Joannie respond to the question, but it's not spelling it out for her exactly what she has to say.
Great. I don't see any other questions, but I do see a wonderful comment about being able to use your suggestions in a dual language classroom. So your impact is far and wide.
Wonderful. Thank you.
So we are just about at that 5 o'clock hour. And if there are no other questions, I think we've come to our end. Candy, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. I'm going to stop the recording.